The rain came down in fine, cold strands, whispering against the earth like 1,000 soft threads being pulled through cloth. It was not the kind of rain that rushed. It was patient, soaking into the ground and into the bones of those who stood too long beneath it. Out on the edge of the valley, a small cabin crouched against the wind, its roof patched in places, its chimney trailing a thin ribbon of smoke that bent sideways in the gusts. She stood on the porch with her mending in her hands, a length of torn sleeve that had been pulled from a basket of chores that never seemed to end. Her fingers worked without much thought, the needle gliding through the cloth as if the motion alone could hold her life together. When the wind shifted, bringing the scent of wet earth and wood smoke, she lifted her head. 2 little girls pressed close at her sides, their shawls too thin for the season. The older stood steady and watchful, the younger leaned against her leg, chin tucked in as though to hide from the cold. They had known harder days than most children their age, but they wore their small, serious faces without complaint. From the open stretch of prairie, a figure appeared through the gray mist. He came slowly, a tall man on horseback, his outline blurred until the rain eased between them for a breath. His coat was long and heavy with water, the leather darkened to nearly black. A wide-brimmed hat shielded his eyes, though she could feel his gaze from a distance. The sound of hooves softened by wet ground drew closer, steady and sure. When he stopped before the porch, the air between them seemed to still, even with the rain threading down around them. He did not look like a man in need of shelter. His horse was strong, his gear well kept. There was a quiet solidity to him, the kind that made a person think of fences built to last, of doors that did not creak when the wind pushed them. His voice was low, carried over the rain with no strain. "My ranch needs a woman's touch. Your daughters need a father." The words hung in the damp air, neither rushed nor softened, as if he had measured them before leaving his house this morning. The girls looked up at her, wide-eyed but silent. She felt the heat rise to her face, not from flattery, but from the weight of choice pressing against her chest. He spoke of his place beyond the far ridge, where the land rolled wide and open, and the barns stood strong through winter. Of the work that kept his days full but left his nights too long. He did not dress the offer in fine phrases. He told it plain. There would be food, warmth, safety. Not a promise of love, but of steadiness. She listened without interrupting, her mind turning over the past winters, the hunger they had endured, the way she had bartered sewing for flour and mended neighbors' coats in exchange for firewood. She thought of how the wind slipped through the boards of the cabin, no matter how tightly she stuffed the cracks. Her pride bristled. She had built this life with her own hands since her husband passed, and the thought of taking a man's offer felt like stepping into a shadow she might not escape. Yet survival had its own voice, and it spoke quietly in the back of her mind as the rain trickled down her sleeve. The younger girl coughed softly. The man's eyes shifted to her for a moment, and something in his face changed. Not pity, but a kind of recognition, as if he knew what it was to stand in the cold with nothing to spare. "I can't give you an answer now," she said, her tone steady. He nodded once, a movement small and certain, as if he had expected nothing more. "I'll be by again," he said. "Take your time." With a tilt of his hat, he turned his horse and rode back into the rain. She watched his shape fade until he was only a shadow among the pale grasses, the sound of hooves swallowed by the wind. The girls shifted against her. "Will he come back?" the older asked, her voice barely above the patter of rain on the porch boards. She did not answer right away. Instead, she looked out across the gray stretch of land, the rain blurring the far hills, and felt the pull of 2 tides, the one that anchored her to this small, worn cabin, and the one that urged her toward the unknown warmth of another life. When they finally stepped inside, closing the door against the weather, she still stood a moment longer by the window, her hands resting on the sill. Outside, the prairie seemed endless, the rain falling steady as breath. Somewhere beyond those hills, a man she barely knew carried his quiet offer home with him, and she could not yet say whether it was a gift or a weight. But she knew the question would not leave her, not tonight, not until she faced him again. The fire crackled low in the hearth. The girls settled at the table with their sewing scraps and their small, careful fingers. She picked up her mending again, but her stitches wavered. The needle passed through the cloth, and still she felt the echo of his words, clear as if the rain were whispering them back to her. My ranch needs a woman's touch, your daughters need a father. She set the sleeve aside, listening to the steady beat of rain on the roof, and realized that somewhere in her chest, the decision was already beginning to take root. It would not bloom tonight, but it would bloom. Morning came with a thin layer of frost glazing the grass, each blade holding its own small shard of light. The wind had stilled for now, and the prairie looked clean-washed from the night's rain. She stood beside the wagon, the girls wrapped in their shawls, the reins cool in her hands. The decision to visit his ranch had not come easily. All through the night she had weighed pride against necessity, safety against solitude. But dawn had a way of making choices clearer, and now the horse stepped forward, carrying them over the slow rise of the valley. The land changed as they drew near. Fences stood straight, not leaning or mended with scraps like most in the area. The barns were painted a deep red, their roofs holding the morning's frost like a silver crown. Beyond them, the main house rose from the earth with the solid lines of work done right, pine boards smooth and sturdy, windows trimmed, shutters secure. There was an order to it all, as though every nail and plank had been set with purpose. He came out from the barn as they rolled in, his coat open, sleeves rolled, a bridle draped over one arm. The girls straightened a little on the bench, watching him the way children watch something they're not sure is safe yet. He lifted the smaller one down first, his hands gentle, and then the older, speaking to them in a tone that was neither overly sweet nor distant. She noticed they did not shrink from him. Inside the house, warmth spread quickly from the stove. The scent of stew reached them before they crossed the threshold, and the girl's eyes followed the bowls he set out, steam curling up like soft breath. He ladled bread onto plates, thick and warm, and said simply, "Eat." They did, without hesitation. She sat across from him, the heat from the food and fire slowly working its way into her hands. After the meal, he showed her around. In the barn, the horses stood with coats shining, their stalls clean and dry. Saddles hung oiled and ready, tools placed in neat rows along the wall. She ran her hand over the wood of the tack bench, the grain smooth beneath her fingers. There was no waste here, no neglect. They spoke as they walked. She asked how long he had been here, and he told her. Years since he was barely a man, the land taken on with nothing but a will to see it through. He spoke without boasting, as though stating a simple fact. She asked about kin, and he shook his head. Some too far, some gone. The girls had wandered to the far end of the barn, drawn to the old shepherd dog dozing there. His tail thumped as they knelt beside him, hands buried in his thick coat. The sound of their laughter rose, small and surprised, and for a moment she stood still, listening to the way it filled the air without effort. He led her outside to the fenced garden, neat rows of soil waiting for spring's touch. A few stubborn greens still clung to life under the fading season. This patch could yield more, he said, if someone tended it steady. He didn't say you, but she heard it all the same. The words were plain, the meaning not hidden. This place could hold them, but it needed care. She hesitated. There was still the matter of what people would say, how quickly tongues wagged in a small settlement. A widow accepting a man's roof in exchange for her work. There would be talk. She told him as much. His expression did not shift much, but his answer came without pause. People talk about anything they can't control, he said. They'll find something whether you give them reason or not. Words don't keep the stove burning. There was truth in that, the kind that landed heavier than pride. She thought of the coming winter, of her girls' worn coats and the cabin walls thin against the wind. Still, the part of her that had stood alone these past years kept its hold, not ready to surrender to a decision made out of fear. By the time they returned to the house, the sun was lowering, tinting the edges of the sky with copper and rose. The girls were drowsy from food and warmth, their heads leaning against each other as she lifted them into the wagon. He stood at the steps, one hand resting on the rail. She thanked him for the meal, for showing her the place. His nod was small, but his eyes held hers a moment longer than needed, as though he understood the shape of her uncertainty. Then he stepped back, letting the wagon roll away without asking for her answer. The ride home was quiet, the steady creak of the wheels and the soft breathing of her sleeping daughters filling the space. She kept her gaze ahead, but the image of the ranch stayed with her. The sound of the dog's tail against the floorboards, the neatness of the tools, the way the house seemed to wait for someone to walk in and make it full. By the time her own cabin came into view, the light had slipped almost entirely from the land. She stepped down from the wagon, the girls still bundled in their blankets, and stood for a moment looking at the weathered boards and the door that leaned a little on its hinges. The wind found its way through the seams as it always did, and she thought of how still the air had felt inside his home. That night, as she banked the fire, she felt the choice settle a little heavier in her chest. It was not an answer yet, but it was closer. The question was no longer whether his offer was good. It was whether she was ready to let her life change into something she had not built alone. Snow began falling before the sun had fully risen, slow and unhurried, each flake drifting in its own quiet path. The wind pushed against the cabin walls, rattling the loose shutter until she wedged a strip of cloth into the gap. The season had shifted almost without warning. Yesterday the air had still held the edge of autumn. Now winter had stepped onto the land with both feet. By midday the sky was a pale, heavy gray, the kind that promised the snow would not stop soon. She was mending near the fire when the sound of hoofbeats reached her through the muffled world outside. The girls rushed to the window, their breath clouding the glass. It was him. He dismounted without haste, the snow gathering on his shoulders, and stepped inside when she opened the door. He carried no more words than necessary, setting a sack of flour, beans, and a bundle of dried apples on the table. The girls eyed the food with the quiet relief of children who have learned not to ask where the next meal will come from. He did not linger over their thanks, only took off his gloves and glanced toward the woodpile by the hearth. Without waiting to be told, he pulled on his coat again and stepped out to the yard. She watched from the doorway as he split logs, his movements steady, the sound of the axe clean against the winter air. By the time he came back in, his breath was a faint mist and the sleeves of his coat were dusted white. The girls followed him to the shed to feed the animals, their small boots leaving uneven trails in the snow. He bent to show them how to hold the grain, how to let the horse take it from their palms without fear. Later, in the kitchen, she set bread on the table, its crust still warm from the oven. He broke off a piece, tasted it, and said it was better than anything he'd had in years. She caught the way his voice softened, almost like the words had surprised him. When the snow deepened and the wind rose, it was clear he would not be riding back tonight. She set another place at the table without discussion, and after supper they sat near the fire. The girls curled in their blankets, half asleep, while the room filled with the muted crackle of burning wood. She asked him then about the winters here, how he managed alone. He told her he worked until there was nothing left to do each day, then found more work just to keep from thinking about the empty hours after dark. She listened, feeling the truth in it. Loneliness had a weight, one she knew well. She spoke of her own winters, the sound of wind finding every gap in the walls, the way the nights stretched long enough to make you feel the years in your bones. He did not interrupt, only watched her with that stillness she had noticed before, as though nothing she said would be set aside or forgotten. When the girls had gone to their bed, the cabin grew quieter. He sat with his hands resting loosely on his knees, eyes on the fire. It was then he told her that loneliness wasn't just being without people. It was the lack of a place where you belonged, where someone's absence could be felt in every corner. "When I saw you that day in the rain," he said, "you looked like someone who'd been holding her whole world together with two small hands." Her chest tightened at the words, not from hurt but from the recognition in them. She had been holding it together, every stitch of cloth, every stick of wood, every meal stretched thin, and there had been no one to see it for what it was until now. Outside, the storm eased near dawn. He left early, the sound of his horse fading into the white distance. She stood on the porch, the cold seeping into her skin, watching him go. The girls waved from the doorway, their breath clouding the air. She turned back into the cabin, the warmth settling around her again. The choice that had been hovering for days now felt nearer, its shape clearer. It was not just an offer anymore, it was a life she could step into if she dared. But the last of her caution held her still, waiting for the moment when hesitation would no longer have a place. The rain came hard that afternoon, driven sideways by a wind that bent the grasses low and blurred the line between earth and sky. She was stirring the pot on the stove when the younger girl's cough broke into a fevered cry. The heat under her skin was sharp, her breathing quick and shallow. Panic moved through her before thought did. She wrapped the child in blankets, told the older girl to stay close, and was out the door into the storm. The path to his ranch was a ribbon of mud, the wagon wheels dragging heavy. Rain stung her face, plastered her hair to her cheeks. By the time she reached the first fence line, the horse was lathered and her arms ached from holding the reins steady. The house rose ahead, solid in the gray wash, its windows lit. He was at the door before she could knock, the sight of her telling him all he needed to know. One glance at the child in her arms and he was already moving, grabbing his coat, pulling a small tin of medicine from a shelf, tucking blankets under his arm. No wasted words. They rode back together, his horse swift despite the weather, the sound of hooves muffled in the rain. Inside her cabin, the fire was coaxed higher, the blankets warmed. He knelt beside the bed, steady hands mixing the medicine into spoonfuls, cooling the child's skin with a damp cloth. Through the long hours of night they worked in quiet rhythm. She fetched water, he measured doses, both speaking only when needed. The older girl curled in the corner, fighting sleep to watch over them. The fever broke near morning, the child's breathing easing into something softer, her small fingers unclenching from the blanket's edge. Relief came slow but deep, settling in her chest as she met his gaze over the bed. There was no triumph there, only quiet steadiness, as though he had simply done what needed doing. When the first pale light slid across the floor, she realized she had been holding her answer for far too long. She reached for his hand, her voice low. "I'll marry you." For a moment he was still, then he nodded once, his fingers closing gently over hers. There was no rush in the way he said yes, only the weight of something decided long before this morning. The older girl, hearing, let out a breath she had been holding, though neither of them turned to look. The wedding was small, held a week later under a sky still wet with rain. A few neighbors stood by, hats pulled low against the drizzle. The girls wore ribbons she had saved for years, tied into their hair, and clutched wildflowers damp from the fields. His hand was warm in hers as they spoke the simple vows, the words carried off by the wind almost as soon as they were spoken. They rode back to his ranch together, the wagon wheels cutting dark tracks in the wet earth. The fields glistened from the rain, and the house ahead stood open, its door swinging wide as if it had been waiting all this time. The girls leaned against her, their faces lifted toward the smell of bread baking in the stove, the sound of the dog's bark carrying across the yard. She stepped down first, the mud pulling gently at her boot. He came around to lift the girls down, one by one, his hands careful, his smile small but sure. Inside, the air was warm, the rooms already holding the sense of a place claimed. That night, when the rain began again, she listened to it from the comfort of walls that did not sway, a roof that did not leak. The girls slept deep, their breathing even. He sat across from her at the fire, the light catching the lines of his face. The thought came to her then, not of rescue but of belonging. Sometimes love did not arrive as a blaze to burn the world open, but as steady rain, falling until the ground beneath you was green again. She met his eyes and saw the same truth reflected there, and for the first time in years, She felt the weight of winter lift before it had even begun.